That was the thing.
Nix him.
But I did get this, which seems to have taken But so the one that you use.
Yeah, core version.
Awards.
Yeah,
Is it-
it was a better.
Yeah.
I mean, it just like objectively.
So did you have the original and the red version of it?
Correct. I had the original with this.
Wow,
You're a great cliff there.
So this one.
Oh.
Jumble there. They're starting to give me a look.
You have a lot of more
transition.
Yeah, like
And
then,
so all the
Where's the gong?
figure out a time for
Ben?
Yeah.
Yes, sure. Yes.
Really
nice to
me.
Starting out with
Monday's
There are several, but I can do it it's in the afternoon. The morning is tough, even more prestige.
Wait, actually, no. I don't have class on Monday because I'm giving it, there's an exam that's happening, so Monday's, yeah, no, that's
All right, ladies and gentlemen, excuse my voice. We
We never
are,
do on other weeks, why should we?
and it begins. This is how things go. Anyway, today we have Jonathan Doyen with us. Jonathan received his bachelor's degree from the University of South Florida, working with the infamous Tom Sanaki, who you may or may not know. But it was infamous in my world. In 2010, he then went on to the University of Southern Mississippi. I'm sure much to Tom's dismay, because Tom is not an ecological psychologist. Worked with our own Alan Heinel, where he received his PhD in 2018. He is relatively recent. His work involves nonlinear dynamics, as you might imagine, perception, action, crazy things like multifractals. He has moved into the virtual realm, so he might. Well, I don't know if he can come back or not. Let's hope he can. He does seem to be actually here now, so we will let him give his talk.
I'm just trying to upload myself to the mainframe.
Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah, so
We don't clap to welcome you.
thank you guys for having me.
we preach.
No, please.
No,
Those
really.
three.
No, don't encourage
Those
them. These three need to be quiet.
Yeah, so thank you guys for having me. Like Jay mentioned, I am a recent graduate from Alan Heinel's lab. I graduated over the summer, so I've still kind of got that new car smell about me. And so I hope you'll forgive my nerves. This is, really exciting to be here for this. So what I'm going to be talking about is largely what I did for my dissertation work, which involves how multifractal structure of our exploratory movements can help sort of explain the unfolding perceptual process, right? And this is going to be in the context of virtual reality, and I brought a little demo. Hopefully it will work out. Obviously, this is kind of a different crowd than you would typically see. But if I asked you, what do you think of when you hear the term fractals? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Damien Stephen.
Julia Blau. You'll see you, Damien, and Reggie Blau.
Yeah. So, I mean, your average individual might think of these really fancy geometric patterns that you might see at a music festival for one reason or another.
Julia said fractals, they're so pretty.
Yeah. So these really pretty geometric designs that obviously have some interesting structure to it. This sort of self-similarity where the pattern of the image sort of repeats as a function of scale. So the larger pattern sort of repeats at smaller scales and so on. And artists use this, they sort of couch nested patterns and ever-branching pathways in some of their art. But these are just fancy mathematical sets, right? So these were kind of pioneered by Benoit Mandelbrot in the 70s, and he found these mathematical sets to have these really cool features to it: self-similarity, scale invariance, and we see this in time series data, like we kind of mentioned. So this is kind of what I'm going to be talking about: is looking for fractal structure in time series data that's related to movement and how that might relate to perceptual systems. So why should we care about fractals? Well, they're kind of everywhere. They're pretty cool. We see them in nature, in plants, in the things that we eat, in the branching of rivers, the structure of mountains and clouds and these sorts of things. But very clever researchers have been able to work this unique mathematical coincidence into research. So in the biomedical realm, we know that sort of things like our cardiovascular system tends to be fractal, right? So we can use this to sort of help us understand what's going on in the system. So Peng and their research group studied the interbeat interval variability of the heart. And so they would track the timing between individual beats, and they would use a DFA analysis to quantify how fractal that heartbeat structure is. And they were able to use that to differentiate between cardiac congestive heart failure patients versus healthy controls, where the healthy controls exhibited steeper slopes in this graph here, this top line, showing sort of a stronger fractal signature of their heartbeat, sort of more complexity in their heartbeat signature, compared to the congestive heart failure individuals who showed more shallow slopes. But you can sort of see there's this regime change here. The idea is that the cardiac patients had this loss of complexity. The signal isn't as complex anymore. But for these researchers, it was a way to sort of differentiate it, to classify between these groups and make predictions about what is happening as a function of the changing variability in the heart signal, right? So this was also done in locomotion studies. So Hausdorff and others have found that the interstride interval tends to break down as a function of the onset of things like Huntington's disease. So you can see sort of two representative time series here, where the control subject, the healthy subject, sort of has this sort of random walk attribute to their time series. But you can see the individual with Huntington's disease is less structured. There's less structure here, right? And similarly, the degree of fractality in their movement was able to sort of classify these two groups. We could sort of make predictions based on how complex their walking behavior was. So this is a useful classifier, a useful descriptor tool, right? It also has practical applications. So Wang and Yang built these vibratory insoles for just a pair of sneakers, and they asked people to sort of maintain just quiet stance, and they measured how stable the individual's posture were. And in one group, the vibratory patterns was just sort of white noise, no real structure to it. And then another group was given a sort of fractal pattern to that vibratory at the insole. And what they found was that the individuals with the fractal patterns in their shoes, so to speak, were much more stable compared to the control group. And so this is a case where we can sort of leverage fractal patterns to make practical improvements in day-to-day actions, right?
Do we have an intuition as to why that should work?
That's a good point. I certainly don't have that just yet. They talk about it in the paper, but I need to go back and look. So it has all these uses, but so far I've just been talking about fractals sort of in general. So I want to take a second to differentiate between monofractals and multifractals, because the rest of this talk is going to concern multifractal structure. So in a monofractal system, the overall behavior of the system is sort of sees equal contributions as a function of scale. So there's just a single scaling relationship between the variability that we see in the system and the actual size of the sample at which we look at the data set. In a multifractal system, there's lots of different scaling relationships. There's a heterogeneity to it, where sometimes a particular sample size will contribute more or less to the overall outcome of the system compared to its counterparts. And so these disproportionate contributions sort of indicate that there's this heterogeneity in how the variability changes as a function of scale when we zoom in and zoom out. And so if you imagine we have this sort of waterfall where there's water sort of pooling at the top, there's this sort of homogeneous distribution of the water. As it approaches sort of a precipice and starts to break apart by the craggy surfaces and maybe the wind blows it around a bit, different channels start to arise. And if we zoom in on just a single scale, we can sort of see that some of the water sort of falls off to this direction, some of it's pooling over here. There's sort of a, one scale of variability, but then if we look at another scale further down, we can see different contributions as a function of scale. Now that this channel might be providing more to the overall outcome than these channels up here, and so on, and we can take different samples at different scales to see. And when there's this sort of disproportionate contributions of these different samples, we get the signature of heterogeneity and thus the signature of multifractality. So in the context of this sort of cascade, if every single sample is sort of contributing equally to the outcome, if there's a homogeneity in the contributions of the scales, then we consider the system to be monofractal. Alternatively, this disproportionate contribution, this heterogeneity, concerns the multifractal structure in these systems. So another way to think about this is, imagine that I'm this spooky spider hanging out in a big web, and I'm hungry, and a little fly kind of flies around and is dumb enough to get caught in my web, right? I'm immediately alerted to the fact that, oh, there's some changes in this system that are propagating down that specify, oh, hey, there's lunch. I gotta go rush over here and chow down, right? So this is a small perturbation to the system that contributes very greatly to whether or not I'm eating today, right? But now imagine the case that a big gust of wind kind of comes by and blows the whole system around. I don't really care about that because I know that there isn't any lunch, it's just some ghost that's sort of passing through the way or what have you, right? And so in this case, a really large fluctuation doesn't really amount to much in terms of the overall behavior of the system, but a very small fluctuation in this case sort of propagates through and really sort of brings things to bear. So this is sort of the way to consider these multifractal systems. So all this talk about scale, why should we be considering scale? Why is scale so important? So if I were to ask you how long the coast of England is, I think most of us are familiar with this already, and I give you a yardstick, say yay big, well, let's say 200 kilometers. I'm sorry.
Never mind.
Well, in that case, forget it.
You'll forgive me. So let's say that we're considering the coast of Britain with a particular yardstick, right? And we use that yardstick and we map out all the convolutions and nooks and crannies that we can. We're going to get some measurement about the length of the coastline. Now imagine that I asked you to do the same thing with a much shorter yardstick. Now we can sort of actually get into those convolutions, and there's a lot more structure here, a lot more sort of features, and the coast becomes longer, right? Now if we do this again, sort of ad infinitum, we find that the coast is actually infinitely long depending on the measurement that we take. So it's really important to consider the scale at which we're observing a system and the scale at which we're measuring the system, right? Now, why should we care about these two things, the scale at which we're measuring and the scale at which we're observing? We have to remember for our purposes that we are not some disembodied perceiver actor existing in some kind of void We are an individual that is embedded in some environment. This kind of looks like home to me. I'm from Tampa. So all this snow is very strange to me. So we are individuals that are embedded in some kind of environment, right? And within us, we have lots of other stuff going on. There's cognitive stuff, sensory stuff, motoric stuff, all sort of working in concert to produce behavior. And so we have, several different levels at which we can sort of examine the outcome of this large integrated system. So Gottlieb, his idea was that over time, any kind of changes at one scale should produce changes at other scales in a bidirectional manner. And if we wanted to say something about one scale, we should be able to tap into another scale, observe it at that scale, and say something about something located elsewhere in the system, right? So, how does this concern what I am interested in and what I've been doing? So, obviously, if these fractals are sort of omnipresent and we can use them in research to produce practical outcomes and changes, then we should consider ourselves as this large integrated system with the environment, and we can use the fractal structure as sort of a mechanism to explain what's going on when we're behaving. We can explain the outcomes using this, right? So you guys might be familiar with this guy, Jackson Pollock. There was also a movie that came out not too long ago. My kid could paint that, I think. He got really famous for putting together these really big paintings that just kind of looked like he just kind of had a tantrum and starts throwing paint around, right? Yeah. These drip paintings. They were very interesting, but it caused a lot of backlash. Like a lot of hey, my kid could do that. What is this? This is art? Well, it turns out that the patterns in his drip paintings were fractal. And through some careful analysis, these researchers sort of described how fractal these paintings were and found that over time, his paintings grew more and more fractal. And so this is kind of interesting, whether or not he was intending any of this. I didn't get a chance to interview the guy, but whether or not his intentions, whether he was actually structuring these things to be fractal is a good question. But the idea is that the changes in the structuring of his paintings over time are going to be sort of inextricably linked to the sort of cognitive architecture, what is happening in the aging mind, right? So this might be sort of a window into something a bit more interesting about the system. So, in my lab, with Alan and some of the other grad students, we first started asking questions about how can we sort of connect what most would typically think of as being a purely mental event, just thinking about some surface in the environment. We want to connect it to their movement because we think that this is one big integrated system. So we asked participants just to look at a big ramp and just think about whether or not that would afford standing on. Would you be able to stand on this ramp, yes or no? And we had lots of different angles. And during this time, we would record their posture just with an optical motion tracking system. And just the tiny little bit of wiggle that they exhibited during this task, we would use to characterize the fractal fluctuations of the posture during this task. And that measure of the signature of fractality went on to predict whether or not they would say yes or no to this particular task. So this was sort of the foundation of several subsequent experiments. Very recently, we published a paper where we asked people to perform the same task, but this time we were interested in how the exploratory movement might sort of cascade over time throughout different types of judgments. So here I'm just going to sort of walk through the task sequence and sort of explain after the fact explicitly what we were looking for. So we would first start the trial and we would have the individual performing the same task. They would just look at the ramp and think to themselves, would this be stand-onable or not? And during this time we asked them to stand as still as possible just for 15 seconds while we record their motion. And so during this segment, I want to make very explicit, this was the only time that we measured their posture. So we measured for 15 seconds and then turn off the camera, and then that is the end of our measure of multifractality, right? Afterwards, yeah, so no longer measuring postural sway from here on out. Afterwards, we would ask them the affordance question, can you stand the host, yes or no? And then after that, we would ask them for a confidence rating in that judgment. So how confident are you in your response? And we would measure that 1 to 7, right? And then finally, we would ask them to match a second surface. So in this case, there is a small surface that is felt but not seen. It's completely occluded, and it's at the foot. And so they would place their foot onto the smaller ramp, and I would adjust it until they told me that the two were perceptually parallel, right? The two were at the same angle. And then we also tested the case where they would feel a surface and then match it visually. So we did sort of both realms.
Can I ask whether the slope manipulation was it a random slope manipulation or was it increasing, decreasing?
It was, well, the adjustment would be increasing or decreasing, but the original stimulus was random.
It was random.
The stimulus was random, but then the adjustment would either start shallow and then go up, or then steep and then go down. So what we have here, again, I want to highlight the fact that we measured stability just for 15 seconds and then stopped, and then asked them affordance, confidence, and matching. And so what we found is that our measurement of multifractality early on, during their sort of exploration of the stimulus while they're just sort of thinking about it, along with the effects of whatever condition they were in and the actual stimulus, right? This sort of measurement went on to predict whether or not they would say yes or no. And then those two components went on to predict how confident they were in that previous response. And then all three components went on to predict how they would match the two surfaces. Now there's a lot more behind this. This is just a kind of a glimpse at it. But the idea is that, remember, we stopped measuring their movement. The movement is divorced from these responses now. It's not like we're measuring the multifractality during their response, right? But it's still implicated in these judgments downstream. So the idea is that this exploratory movement sort of persists and it sort of carries on, it cascades through these sequential judgments, and these judgments of different types, qualitatively different types. So there's something about this that is sort of inextricable from the ongoing unfolding process several seconds removed from the measurement, right? So this was a very recent, very interesting. So on to the sort of current experiment, what I did for my dissertation. In my dissertation, I transitioned from stand-on ability, questions, into more questions about distance. So this was motivated originally by Sinayui and he, who found that egocentric distance is sort of compressed as a function of the composition of the surface. So they did these experiments where they asked individuals to assess the distance of a target object on the ground. Sometimes across some discontinuity, they might have been standing on concrete and estimating an object out in the grass, or vice versa, they might have been standing in the grass, assessing over concrete. So there's this discontinuity here. They also tested cases where the surface was completely homogeneous, either all concrete or all grass. And what they found was this reliable compression of perceived distance. So you can see here the dashed line is perfect accuracy, the identity line. This line with the squares, just below the sort of identity line, is the homogeneous condition. So this was when there was no discontinuity in the ground. They were pretty accurate with just metric judgments, right? Now, in the case where there was some kind of discontinuity, you can see the line with the circles here, there is this sort of compression effect. The perceived distance was much shorter than the veridical distance. And the authors kind of explained this as it could be due to some perceived slant in the distal surface that causes the object to look a bit closer. There's some other questions about it. So we wanted to do something similar, but rather than asking people for sort of metric judgments, we wanted to couch it in something functional, like an affordance task. So we did this pilot in the real-world laboratory setting, where we set up this long table and had people sit at one end of it, and we placed a little ping pong ball on top of a black surface and just asked them, would you be able to reach this, yes or no? Now this was also always scaled to the individual's actual reaching capabilities, And so we tested 9 different distances, with the center distance being their actual arm length. And then to produce a discontinuity, we just laid a little bit of white tablecloth about 50 centimeters away from the individual, and then asked them to perform the same test to see if that discontinuity would produce any kind of distortions in their reaching perceptions. Yeah.
Is the table right up against them so they are limited to using just the arm?
Yes, yeah, and we explicitly told them to imagine doing this task without any kind of postural reconfiguration. So just like imagine if you just stuck your arm out, right? And they were never allowed to reach. They were never allowed to like look down at their arm and kind of like use it as a visual ruler, right? I was very careful with that. So
in the experiment originally, do we have the other order, grass to concrete?
yes, yes, and I believe these are collapsed across
They're
those.
collapsed across.
So I think this
I
is
remember that literature.
yeah,
They did both, okay.
yes, they did.
And not a difference.
Uh,
Going from grass to concrete, concrete to grass.
I don't believe so. I believe that this
Trying to
this
remember
data
the
is
chart.
the collapse across those two.
I know the data.
I'll double check. So this was a sort of pilot experiment that we did in the actual laboratory settings, and we just asked them to hold up sort of a little card so that they couldn't see me hurriedly around changing the stimulus from trial to trial. I had a big
Particularly doing that.
clipboard, yeah. I had to get out of the way so that they didn't see me, and then it was
It was random again.
yes, purely randomized. So this was kind of a logistical nightmare, lots of exercise on my part. So we did this, but then this also opened up several other questions. We thought about, well, there's sort of an interesting variable in terms of luminance here. So if we're taking sort of light as being the information for vision as a starting point, we realized that these tables sort of reflect differing values of light, so the overall surface luminance could be interesting. So we just thought, okay, let's think about this. What if we put this into virtual reality and save myself a little bit of legwork, so I don't have to, so I can kind of automate this stuff.
Well, it's really just you being lazy.
But more interesting is what are the consequences of a simulated optical array versus while embedded still in a real environment? That's kind of an interesting question. And then we wanted to shoehorn in movement because we're interested in these fractals, and so we can use this as sort of an explanatory variable, a predictor. So we took this pilot experiment and we developed several different virtual reality environments, and we asked people to sit at a virtual table. None of this is real. There was no table, no stimulus, but same setup. We replicated it one-to-one with the actual laboratory experiment, so same dimensions, same everything. And we tracked their head motion using maybe a non-traditional manner of motion tracking. But before that, I want to just mention that I did bring sort of a simple demo of one of the pilot experiments. This will look different than the video on the following slide, but if you guys are curious, you can just kind of hold this up to your face, and there's a large sort of circular pad here. If you just tap the pad, it'll advance to the next trial. So you can kind of see what the table might have looked like. The object in there is a different color, but if you guys are interested, feel free to
Start with Mike, I'm 6, so I don't want
You learned this lesson from the hen.
I'll be next to last.
Feel free to pass this around. So what you'll see in here is a version of the experiment.
No, start with him, he can't.
You give it to Mike.
Don't give it to Mike. Give it to Claire.
No,
Nose is
no,
on the bottom.
Nose is on the bottom.
Give it to Mike, he
Give it to
likes
Claire.
everything.
You had it right the first time. You just need to hold it up to your eyes for a moment or two, and then it should. Yeah, it'll be black for a moment, but then
That's it. That's
Ah,
what
there you
give
go.
it a second.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what you'll see in this is a very early version of the experiment where the stimulus is a different color. The background, there's no background to it. On the next slide here, you'll see a sort of representative video of the trial. So what you'll see here is there's some instructions, and you can see the participant is kind of getting acquainted. And you can see a textured background. We sort of built this sort of open space, and then in a moment you'll see the table and the objects sort of crop up. And the table is going to be made of different textures. Sometimes it's going to be bright, sometimes it's going to be dark, sometimes it's going to be a boundary, sometimes the object is at different distances. So what we did to track their movement is we took a very clever piece of code that...
Did you do say so yourself?
yeah, we took some very clever MATLAB code and used this pixel differencing method where we took each pixel of the video frame and compared it to the very next frame, under the assumption that the pixel from here to here and the pixel from here to here, if there are differences, they're going to be necessarily related to any transformations of the head because the camera is attached to the head. So whenever they move their head, the pixels are necessarily changing because the environment is stationary and the headset is not, if that makes sense. So we used this and quantified the differences between each frame to generate a time series that we could then submit to the multifractal analysis. So I am deeply indebted for this method. So you can sort of get an idea of what the experiment sort of looked like. And this person is maybe falling asleep, I don't know. They're kind of bouncing around. I hope they didn't sneak in headphones, I don't know. So we used this, this time series of differences in the video frames, and we used a version of the DFA that relied on the direct estimation of the multifractal spectrum, which I'll get to in a moment. But essentially what this does is it carves up the time series and fits local linear models to assess how much variability there is at every available scale. So at this particular scale, what does the variability look like? And then we break it up further, fit more models, and then what does the variability look like at this scale? And so we do this iteratively to produce a set of scaling exponents that describes how the variability sort of grows or decays as a function of this zooming in and zooming out of the original data set. And for our purposes, we're interested in this multifractal spectrum, which is sort of, in brief terms, just a description of the complexity in the data. So how complex is the overall signal? So, you know, I often tell students and my friends, they don't listen to me, but I'm like, oh, it's a distant cousin of like standard deviation, and then they ask me, what's a standard deviation?
Start at the beginning.
Yeah. So it's a description of the variability, but in this case, exactly. Yeah.
Here's the standard.
No. I still pretend like we're friends on Facebook. They're okay. So you can imagine the scenario where somebody can move a whole heck of a lot and be really variable in their movement, but not very complex, right? And you can imagine the other scenario where they're not really moving a whole lot, but they're really complex in their movement, right? So this is what we're going to be interested in, is how broad is their spectral width. And we're going to use that value, a single value, it's just a participant level value. We recorded the whole video and we computed the spectrum based on that entire video. So we use this spectrum width as a predictor for our statistical models. So I'll talk about that in just a second. So the actual paradigm, we asked them to do somewhere between 108 and 135 trials where they would just respond yes or no, I could reach that object. And we also kept track of their response times. I don't talk about that here. We didn't find a whole lot with it, but there's still work to do with that. But we used a distance method of, we generated these pi ratios where we would measure an individual's arm length, effectively their reaching capability, and we would set the distance either at exactly at their arm length or some fraction thereof. So it ranged from maybe 60% of their reaching capability all the way up to 140%, very far, very unreachable. And so anything below a 1 should be considered veridically reachable. Anything above 1 should be considered unreachable, right? So in this case, much like you might have seen in the goggles, they had full range of motion around a fixed perspective. So they were...
I think this side didn't get it in.
Yeah, and please interrupt me if it goes haywire or something and it doesn't work. I'd rather stop and help than
Start showing family photos.
yeah. Please let me know. So they had full range of motion. They weren't restricted in any fashion except for the actual perspective inside of the virtual world. They, you know, as they transferred, they couldn't get up and walk around the laboratory, so to speak, for constraint purposes. And then we tried to predict their responses just using mixed effects logistic regressions, where we were trying to predict their response as a function of the distance variable pi, the presence or absence of a discontinuity on the table, the overall luminance of the table, and then also these two movement parameters. We took just the gross measurement, the raw magnitude of their movement, the average movement, the mean. And then we also computed this multifractal width. So we set up this sort of standard statistical parameter as sort of like a straw man. We wanted to say, hey, this complexity parameter is going to beat out the raw description of what is a non-stationary time series for which the mean isn't really super useful. So we set it up such like this to predict their affordance responses. Yeah.
So when you're thinking about this, how many participants did you have in this? Just
Anywhere between 28 and 31 for each experiment.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's going to be, I think the lower bound is 28 and the upper bound is 31. And I'm going to mention it as we go through each. So just as a broad overview, we did 4 experiments. And we started off the first experiment trying to replicate the pilot experiment that we did in the real world. So in this case, discontinuity and luminance were sort of conflated because we used just these table plots. The discontinuity doesn't vary systematically. The luminance doesn't vary systematically. So we decided, let's just try and quickly replicate it and then separate those two variables into individual experiments. So the second experiment, we kept luminance constant, but tested the presence or absence and location of a discontinuity. And then in the third experiment, we tested just luminance, so we took out the presence of a discontinuity. And then in the final experiment, we put experiments 2 and 3 together. So we tested both variables again in a much more systematic way. So this is just a quick overview. So in this case, we gathered 29 people, and we set up the experiment such as this. These were the 4 conditions that they saw, and we grouped these into groups of these 2 tables were the low luminance conditions, because they're mostly black or all black. We grouped these 2 tables into the higher luminance conditions, because it's all white or mostly white. And then these 2 tables became our discontinuity present conditions, because there was this boundary where the 2 colors abut. And then we had these 2 tables that were discontinuity absent. They're completely homogeneous. So these were the conditions that they found. And I'm only going to touch on some of the findings that are related to multifractal, the multifractal parameters, but there's a lot to this data set, so we can chat about that later. So in this case, in trying to predict their responses, some of this is going to be tough to read. So what we see here is on the vertical scale is the proportion of their yes responses. So at the top is 100% yes, and then at the bottom is 100% no. Along this axis is the distance, the pi ratio. So at the back is very close to the participant. At the front is very far away from the participant with their actual reaching capability somewhere in the middle. And then along the bottom here is the degree of multifractality. So on the left is very low in complexity. On the right is very high in complexity. And so what you'll see is at the very close distances, they're responding almost always 100% yes. Yes, I can reach it. It makes sense, right? It's super close. No big deal. At the very far distances, they're almost always saying no. So this is a great psychometric curve, right? So this is just the discontinuity absent condition. This is just for cases where the table is completely homogeneous, right? But when there is a discontinuity present, we see something kind of interesting. So we still see the same general pattern, but at the farthest distances, you see that people that are low in complexity are saying yes more often to very, very far objects. Why are they saying yes to stuff that is 140% of their length, their arm's length, right? That's kind of interesting. And so the sort of, my gut feeling is that when a person is moving more complexly than they would be otherwise, they're generating maybe a richer optic structure on which they're basing their judgment on. So you're not going to get, when you're moving very complexly, you're not going to get these sort of aberrations where you're saying, yes, I can reach that thing that is very clearly out of reach. Because sort of the quality of information is maybe a bit higher. It's just a speculation on my part, but it's kind of my running hypothesis so far. So this is the interaction between whether or not there's a discontinuity present, multifractality, and distance. And so it's interesting that it's discontinuity that teases this out. So why should the presence of this simple line on the table be affecting it in this manner? There's a zillion different guesses to that. We can talk about that, but the thing that I want to highlight is that multifractality is differentiating these two groups in that when the table is homogeneous, complexity doesn't seem to make much of a difference, but here, when there is a discontinuity present, the complexity sort of separates these two groups as a function of high and low complexity. So maybe that's something interesting to think about. So this was the first experiment, trying to replicate the pilot experiment. The pilot, we didn't have any kind of movement data, so that was kind of it's tough to compare. But so because these two variables were originally sort of conflated, we wanted to tease them out. And so we designed a version of the experiment where we had several tables that all had the same luminance, but this time we varied the presence and location of a discontinuity. So the discontinuity occurred either at 0% of the table, that is like the very edge, so there's no discontinuity, right? Or 20, 40, 60, and 80% of the table's length. And so it's kind of interesting. I don't really touch on it too much in this presentation, but why, I would ask the question, why should we expect a discontinuity that's way off in the distance to affect what's happening in a much more immediate task space? Because this table is something on the order of 2 meters, I think, and the actual reaching distance is certainly not way out here. And 80% of 2 meters is much farther than this immediately relevant task space.
And just remind me, how free are the observers for moving their heads around and looking?
Completely physically unrestrained.
Yeah, unrestrained, and have a movements of the trunk?
They're seated in just a computer chair.
Yeah.
And we don't...
so you don't put any restrictions on them?
No.
So they could be doing this?
They could,
Yeah.
but
So-
but the
So it
perspective...
would not change the perspective.
It's
Yeah.
all virtual.
The actual
Oh, yeah, of course.
the actual perspective doesn't change. So I could lean forward, but
But it would.
yeah.
So it's changed.
And so we also controlled for like eye height. So we measured how tall they were in the chair, and that was computed in the perspective. So yeah.
What do you mean perspective doesn't change?
So imagine the camera in the virtual world is at a fixed point. They can rotate all about that point,
But it doesn't translate.
but that point doesn't translate with their actual sort of lateral.
So their head rotations are tracked,
Yes.
but not the head translations.
Yes.
Okay.
So the only real consequence of an exploratory movement would be a rotation?
Rotations.
Rotation.
Yes.
No parallax, no
Yeah,
change,
right.
no?
Yeah. So there are more steps to be taken in this
Yes.
direction, but for this experiment, yeah.
Thank you, Claire.
So yeah, that is something that we're going to do. So in this version, we have this discontinuity that occurs at all these different distances. They were still asked the same questions, same 9 distances, same setup. Now we have 29 more people. And in this case, it's a similar experiment, but in this case, we didn't find any effects of discontinuity in this case. What we have here is the same sort of logistic function, and you can see that again, the sort of differentiating factor here, this is just distance and multifractality. The differentiating factor here is the complexity. So at the very close distances, when you're very complex, people are saying no to objects that are very close to you, which is potentially interesting. I don't know why. There's no way I could reach that. It's very close. I don't know. But at the very far distances, again, we see this sort of differentiation between very far objects appear to be reachable for people that are not moving very complexly. And so the really important difference exists somewhere in this middle, where you can see sort of the 2 different groups are transitioning from yes to no at different rates here. So that's potentially interesting. So it's this multifractality that is sort of differentiating these individuals in terms of what they see as being reachable and not reachable. Yeah.
So these are just the model predictions. You're not really sure that those areas are actually populated at all.
Right, these are just the model
Yeah.
predictions, yeah. So I don't have the means plotted here. Good point.
So there may not be anybody there, right?
Right,
In,
right.
in that corner, in that sort of the weirdo corners, for example, there may not be anybody.
Right. I will need to go back and replot it.
And this does not reflect where the discontinuity occurred.
Right. This has no concern with the discontinuity here. In this experiment, if I remember correctly, there wasn't much effect for the discontinuity, which is kind of interesting that whether the discontinuity was close or far or non-existent didn't seem to bear on the actual judgments.
So for the sequential surface integration
Yes.
hypothesis people,
Yes.
it should matter if the
Yes.
discontinuity is past where the target is. Then who cares? It's not going to interrupt your integration.
Right.
One would imagine if one subscribed to that.
Right, right. But there was a very interesting paper a few years, pretty recently, with the optical tunnel, right? And yes, and so the
I'm
background.
reading the dissertation that was based on that right here.
So that's kind of what I hinted at as to why should we care about what's happening in the background, and so in that paper, the background did very much matter. And in the final experiment, there were effects of discontinuity, not reported in this presentation, but there were effects of discontinuity where the farthest discontinuity was the one that's driving the effect. I don't think we found effects of the closer discontinuities, which we're not sure if there is some sort of visual illusion happening, like the horizontal vertical illusion, or some framing effect of the boundary and sort of changing the perceived distance of the object. I talk a little bit about it in my paper, but I don't have a definite answer for that. But in this experiment, I think the effects of the discontinuity are lacking here. Yeah.
Can you remind me again how you're coming up with your index on the? Yeah.
This is the multifractal width. So from the time series of head transformations that we pull from the video, we estimate the spectral width, and then this is just a continuous scale of low multifractality up to high multifractality. I don't remember the range here. I can get that if necessary, but this is just the multifractality, the MFW.
And that's for all the data recorded during the entire experiment.
Yes, so it's a participant level variable, so each person gets one descriptor of their complexity.
So that's during all the time that they're not doing anything also. Is there much time where they're not doing anything?
No, the trials are pretty quick. They see it and respond. And so the inter-trial intervals are pretty short.
Okay.
But as a practical constraint, because this type of analysis has a sort of lower limit, so we had to take we couldn't break it down to the trial level, which we want because it's so quick, and the video is 60 frames a second. So we thought about breaking it up into blocks. These were blocked into 3 blocks of randomized trials. That's for further analysis. There's lots more work that I have planned.
Sorry, just so the model, when we're thinking about the model, the variance that each participant is giving, so each participant then is only giving one line of data to the eventual model, correct?
No.
Okay,
No.
so because the multifractal width is going to be repeated across the individual.
Yes.
Then for each distance, they're getting one. So each person is giving at each distance only one of that. So it's however many distances times one participant. Or is there an additional one for each? Because the multiple luminance, that's between subjects or within subjects?
Within.
Or within subjects.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So you've got the MFW is repeating for each of them.
Yes.
And then the other ones are varying.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So, as there are lots more directions for this. This was experiment 2, discontinuity only. So we thought, okay, well we have to test luminance also, right? So in this case, we varied the overall luminance of the virtual table just as a function of the pixel intensity, which ranged from a grayscale value of 0 being black and 255 being white in equal steps. And so we have just sort of black, dark gray, neutral gray, and so on. And we had 28 people, and again, we asked them to perform the same task, 9 different distances. Can you reach this, yes or no? And so again, here's the same model. And this side is going to be just for the lower luminance. condition. So we just did a median split in this case for the visualization. So this is just lower luminance, and you can see again, multifractal is kind of teasing apart. Again, same kind of pattern here, where the farthest distances for the low complexity people, they're responding yes, more than their more complex compatriots. But then in the higher luminance condition, this sort of disappears, almost reverses in terms of the prediction here. So again, in the context of this case, we're seeing some kind of differentiation in the complexity parameter. In this case, it seemed to be driven more under the lower luminance conditions. And remember that the assumption is that under the lower luminance conditions, there's less light being structured immediately around the object. There's less reflected light. So this is sort of an interesting question. Why should the complexity of their sort of exploratory movements, the rotational movements, be interacting with the level of lighting around the target object? So similar patterns. In this case, it's just on the lower end of luminance that we see this differentiation. So again, we're sort of seeing this this pattern driven by the complexity, right? Now, in the final experiment, we put all these variables back together in a more systematic fashion. So we only use 3 luminance levels. I know you see 5 tables here. We didn't use gray more often than the rest, right? But we chose 3 luminance levels from experiment 3, and then we chose the same boundary locations from experiment 2. And we decided to throw this all together. We grabbed 31 people and asked them to perform the same task. And in this case, I have to make mention that we didn't find effects of multifractality in this case. We found effects of the mean, and we did so in a couple of the previous experiments. I haven't touched on that just yet, but these plots now, instead of complexity along this bottom axis, this is the overall raw magnitude of their movement. So people moving a whole lot versus people not moving very much at all. So this is interesting, an interesting question why we found multifractal through the first 3 experiments, but not in this case. But I will make mention of a caveat later on. So we see sort of similar patterns here again, where the movement, now not the complexity, but the movement is differentiating these 2 groups. The people that are moving a whole lot seem to be more or less accurate in their responses versus the people that are not moving a whole lot. They're sort of very greatly overestimating their reaching capabilities at this point, right? And so this is the interaction, again, between luminance levels. Not reported here is the effects of discontinuity, which I think we found some effects. I'll have to look that up, because the first thing I thought of was your paper. So it's interesting. So at the very least, in this case, movement is implicated in this outcome to some extent. So, just as a quick recap across our 4 experiments, I didn't highlight the fact that in the first experiment, we didn't find any effects of raw magnitude movement mean. This didn't drive any of the effects, just multifractality. But in experiments 2 and 3, we did find effects of both across lots of different models. And then in the final one, we didn't find any effects of multifractality. So it's sort of an open question as to why it's sort of transient. I don't know if it's because what's happening here is the experiment is becoming more and more sort of complex in its variables. So I don't know I don't know what to make of this just yet.
So in experiment 4, you still are at the subject level with the multifractal measure?
Yes, yeah. So that was the same for everybody.
But the mean would also be subject level, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
both of those are.
Yes.
Different measures.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was kind of the general sort of support. So at the end of the day, at the very least, we have some kind of support that movement and complexity is important, and it's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the fact that perception unfolds over time and across lots of different scales of time and space, and that the multifractal signature is evidence of just this, of this cross-scale interactivity, right? And maybe this could be reflective of something fundamental about the architecture that's sort of kicking around in our brains, our head buckets. So So that is kind of it. I have lots more to talk about if you guys have any kind of questions now or later. And I just want to briefly thank my comrades in the Perception Action Cognition Lab, Alan for obviously training me, for better or worse, the other grad students in my lab, and then my current lab in the Warfighter Systems Integration Lab in New Hampshire for Revision Military. Chris Palmer, he's a cool guy. I think a lot of you know him. And newly added Brian Higginson, the lab director. Some great guys. So thank you guys for having me. I'm happy to take all of the brutal questions.
Brutal.
Mine's just a sort of suggestion, because it does seem like you have these two things, the need and the MFW, that are sort of warring in terms of like what is causing.
Yeah.
I would love to see one where you manipulated that. Now, I'm like aware of the fact that that can cause motion sickness.
Yeah.
But like you know.
Your lab, not hers. So.
That's right, it's not my lab, so I'm not the one who has to clean up.
I don't have to touch it, yeah.
But have you considered manipulating these two variables and you know, independently to see if one versus the other causes more or less accurate judgments?
Yeah, that's a great point. That is obviously, I think the next step is to sort of actually sort of divine where the fight actually is, the battle between these two. You know, manipulating one over the other is maybe easier. Asking people not to move versus moving a lot, but how to make them move complexly.
Well, I mean, you could do them as videos, couldn't you? Like, you could present them as videos, present them as, I mean, admittedly, it doesn't have quite the same power as them exploring their own environment.
Right.
But you might be able to,
No, that's a good point.
you can create videos that have a higher or less, exactly, impose the structure on the videos.
That is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and how. Yeah.
Don't think about it.
It's time.
Come on, we got like an hour before dinner. We can get this.
Yeah, no, that is a very you know, avenue that is very much on my radar. Yeah.
So one of the things that's been kind of a historical tension with the stuff that Damien's done, and has caused a lot of back and forth with reviewers and advisors and all other people, is that he has always insisted on taking the multifractal measure and using it in interaction with literally every other factor in the design.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, you rarely get anything.
Right.
And you almost never get main effects.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for what you're doing, one of the reasons that you're not seeing that is that your design has gotten complex enough that actually you need the interaction terms now to suddenly come in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably why you're not seeing it.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around sort of the statistical motivations behind structuring the models as they are, and so that's a great point. You know, when I go into it, I usually try every single combination I can, and then think, oh my God, what have I done? I've got this gigantic.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's because it's very non-traditional. But I think the argument that he's always made, and I think I now have come to accept it, but it's taken a long time, is that we're looking at a system that's we're supposed to see interactions across all the scales, and so here you've imposed a whole bunch of things, and now you're surprised that you're getting interactions with them.
Yeah.
Right. Because you've taken the most sensitive measure that we have. It's probably not very good, but best one we have of what those interactions are like. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
So. But it's even more impressive that you're finding things when you're just at the individual.
Yeah, and so that doesn't even touch on. There's a lot of problems with this. You know, I've got a lot of stuff to work on.
Don't tell us that there's problems.
So there's lots more work to do on this, and the story might change a bit, but yeah, that's a very good point. So
Yeah, this is super interesting, and the fact that you've structured your particular experiment in the way that you have, I think that you might have left some variance on the table, where if you had slightly different measures, you could be able to like get more information from it, because you have a very complex model structure.
Yeah.
Like, and given how much it is repeating throughout them, like I feel like you could, and especially because your DV is, you know, because you're doing a logistic regression, you're binning up a whole lot that's happening at each trial just in those 2 bins. Have you thought about doing something where the DV would be continuous? Like, for example, the confidence judgment might be one way that you could do that and then get more out of it.
So not reported here is reaction times.
Yeah,
So
yes.
So we measured reaction times.
She's so excited.
Reaction time.
We did measure. It's a lot less exciting of a story. Yeah.
Take that.
They're horrible.
So again, there's still I got to do a lot more correcting, but the reaction time data, we didn't find much in just the regular statistical modeling. We found some small main effects for individual levels of the discontinuity, I think, but other than that, it was largely a wash. So I got to go back and rethink my approach to that set of data, but we have that data.
Yeah.
It's just I got to go back and sort of.
Did you put a limit on them when you say reaction time data?
Go
Did you
ahead.
say,
No, so we.
so that's, it can be quite variable, of course.
Yeah, so it was just from trial start to trial response, and then it immediately picked back up because the intertrial intervals were the same across every single trial. So it was just from trial start, untimed until they responded. And so obviously it's very, very skewed, and so that's another, that's how it was structured, so, sorry, yeah.
Can I follow up on Alex's question?
Yeah,
Can we
yeah.
go back to one of your surfaces?
Yes.
Oh, that's enough.
Any of them.
Oh, what
No,
kind of-
Or
no,
that's
no,
okay.
no,
No,
the-
Oh, right.
Models.
So, that's not a good one. Give me another one. That's a good one. So, when you'll find out, Mikey. When you talk about sort of the quality of the judgments here, you know, you on one end versus the other.
Yeah.
You sort of concentrate on overestimation and underestimation, as opposed to the steepness
Yeah.
of the
Right.
discrimination.
Yeah.
Right, and here you're seeing that the
There's some
multifractal
differences,
part is much less steep, which most people would say is,
Less discriminating.
you know,
Yeah.
less discrimination going on rather than better.
Yeah.
Still got it.
He thought I lost it.
Is that true of the other pictures that didn't look so good?
This one had better
This-
steepness
this-
differences.
Had the difference in
Yeah.
it, yeah.
But,
Yeah,
so this would make you want to conclude that in this condition, the more multifractal, the worse the discrimination.
Yeah, so my explanation of the sort of vertical accuracy only sort of maps onto their transition point. The more complex people tended to have transition perceptual boundaries that were closer to their reaching capability than the other individuals. Their boundaries tended to be around 1.2, 20% overestimation, and the more complex individuals tended to be a bit closer. So
What happened in the original study with when you really had surfaces out there as opposed to the VR?
it was very similar. Overestimation was exactly the same, which I think is kind of interesting in that virtual reality experiments tend to suffer from this distance compression.
Yeah.
But now couching it in this sort of action-relevant task, we didn't see any difference in the overestimation. So if there was effects of this distance compression, we'd expect them to think that they can reach even farther than they actually could. So everybody's overestimating already, but the fact that the real world versus the VR, they didn't differ in their overestimation. There was no, but the pattern of results was largely similar. We were able to replicate most of the stuff, but even then, our replication study was more complex than the pilot study in the lab experiments. So it's tough to compare the two. So.
Very quick clarification, I'm not trying to jump. How long was one trial? One participant was in the experiment for how long?
The total experimental session from trial 1 to trial end was on the order of 6 to 10 minutes. yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
yeah.
So getting back to the question of the stimulus presentation being random as opposed to in order, one of the reasons that we turn to doing things in order is to not chuck out the dynamics of the process. And one of the things I would be interested in seeing is whether you, in the exploratory movement data, the fractality or multifractality of those data, whether you get a change right before the transition between reachable and not reachable,
Right.
as you do in with things like exploration time
Yeah.
and et cetera, and do you get hysteresis
Yeah.
and yada yada. A method that might help out with respect to Alex's question is, could you do something where the stimulus is being moved out continuously until the person says stop?
Yes.
To get
Yeah.
it to be a little more.
Yeah, that would simple tweak, and that would be very doable. It's just
Or in other words, here are 10 or 15 more experiments that you can
Yeah.
I know.
These are the ones that we would need, not your dissertation.
I know.
but-
That's right, it's not
No,
your
and so
dissertation.
It needs a research program when you get
that is a wonderful question, and
I thought so.
She was a former head of CESPA.
Another
He's a
experiment
new
you could do in the future that isn't this one.
and so we don't have any kind of sort of temporal dimension of how this changes as a function of the distance, and that would be great to look at, whether there's hysteresis or
Yeah, so the first method could still be discrete.
Yeah.
Here's it, could you reach it? And you would expect yes, until they go no, and then
Yes.
the question is what's going on.
Yeah.
This and that. But then the other is more continuous.
right.
And you're welcome to use anything on the board to help you explain the data.
Start taking
Make your choice.
yeah.
So why is it that you're restricting the motions to being just rotations?
Part
Because
of
in
it.
the real world, people are doing everything.
No, you're absolutely right. Part of it was in effort, and this was a problem that sort of compounded as I moved ahead. In the pilot experiment, we restricted their motion by putting them in a chin rest
Oh, you did?
attached to the end of the table, so they were just kind of.
Oh, you didn't tell us that.
Yeah, sorry. we didn't do anything with movement in that version,
Right.
and so we thought in order to make it kind of comparable,
Gotcha.
we did
Yeah.
that, which is why it's an obvious next step to be completely.
Yeah.
Oh, can you revisit those data now that we know that they weren't moving?
Yeah.
So what happened in that one?
In the original experiment, in the pilot experiment.
Yeah, you didn't tell
Right,
us.
it's a real table.
Right, at the real
But
table,
they're in
in a chin rest,
Chin
yeah.
rest. So
Yeah,
there's
to the
no-
table. They don't even rotate their
there's
heads.
nothing.
No, I mean, there's a
little
tiny little bit
rotation.
of wiggle, but yeah, no
Okay.
meaningful
Yeah.
reconfigurations. They're kind of, yeah, they're not dancing at the table like I do. So they were, they were
Keep
seated
going.
in a chin rest, and then we'd occlude their view from trial to trial, and that was how it was moving the object around.
All right.
So that was done so that there would be less chance of them kind of cheating or, to some extent.
And the data showed what?
The data was largely in line with the first experiment. They were fairly comparable, but in that scenario, we measured their affordance responses and also confidence, but no reaction time, and they weren't moving, obviously, so it's kind of difficult to equate the two. But the affordance responding lined up in the same way. The transition points occurred at roughly the same point, and the effects of luminance and discontinuity were fairly similar. I'd have to revisit that and look to see how well they map onto each other, but it was pretty close. Yeah.
I think you should have tracked their eyes because you can
Yeah.
Yes.
you can get motion
Yes.
paralysis
Another
from
experiment
moving
for
your
him.
eyes.
Yeah.
And you can get motion paralysis from rotating your head.
We're writing these down.
I love
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah, so we didn't have an eye tracker at the time. We got one later, and I know that they make sort of inserts for the VR headsets. So
Wow.
that is something that is on my radar also, because that's obviously another huge. That's another scale that's super informative about
Sure.
what's happening.
Or you could have a confound with the complexity of the movement. It could just be movement.
You're right,
That's
and
the risk.
and it's even further sort of obscured by, as much as I love it, the fact that we're analyzing the video and not the actual transform data of the headset
Yep.
or some optical measurement. So it's
I see.
it's kind of an indirect measurement.
Yep.
So
were you, in terms of what you were measuring for movement, not how the optics were changing, but just what you were measuring was?
So, because the camera is sort of strapped to their head,
Yeah.
anytime they move, the camera moves and the pixels in the video change. And so what we did was we took as sort of an indirect description of their head movement the changes in the pixels. So every time a pixel changed,
The angel gets its wings.
every time any of these pixel changes, it's sort of directly implicating the head transformation. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a sort of illusory movement if they like scratch their eye or something, or if it shifts on their head. But we use this as sort of an indirect measure of how they are moving their head.
Can you get the rotational motion out of that?
Not the actual rotational information.
It's rotating at 3x.
It's sort of indirect. It's sort of indirectly related because all we're doing is
So you're just getting a total number of pixels changed from one.
not the
Frame to
number of
another.
pixels, but the intensity of the change. So if this
Okay.
was all black and then
Yeah.
all black,
Yeah.
there's no change,
Right.
right? No motion.
But you do that across all the pixels.
Yes.
Yeah. So it tallies up all of the pixel intensities and
Right.
then computes an average frame to frame to frame, and then that's the
So, okay, so that's not really teasing apart the rotational
No.
motions of this thing.
no. It's only because they're stuck
Right.
at that.
It's just a motion metric.
Yes.
Okay.
Lots of indirect steps.
Yeah.
Give you more beer before we ask you.
So Jonathan, maybe with regards to the video, just showing them. So what is your idea about what it reflects? Because on the one hand, you I think you were saying that it reflects processes within, but it is also the exploration of the array, right? So what is it? What do you think it is? What determines why there's the way that I read your paper, for example, it seems to be tensegrity structure that these time series reflect that, for example. But is it the exploration of the array, or is it both? Or
Yeah.
I think it's both.
So for these experiments, I think it is very much both because, like I said, we didn't have like eye tracking, so we don't know how they're exploring the array that's being presented to them, but they're sort of one step removed, exploring the simulated array through their head transformations, which implicates all the different levels of especially with eye movement. So it's just several steps removed from the actual source, I guess. So I think they're exploring both. I think, and it's interesting to think about how they're exploring this sort of simulated optic array while still being situated in a real environment. So they're sort of necessarily exploring their own environment through their shifts and transformations in the seat itself, and they're getting information from that is supposed to be mapping onto what they're experiencing here, but I don't know. So that's a good question. I don't know if I'm getting at it. Yeah.
And maybe related is how much, to what extent, in terms of effect sizes, do we care about these effects? So because there's a lot of big language being used about multifractality, and I don't read up enough on it to know the effect sizes, but how much do we care if it's really adding something to the exploration in the array, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in these experiments, the effect sizes for the head motion were pretty small. They were quite small. Because the scale at which they're moving is often very, very, very small. They're just tiny little bits of wiggle in it, right? But they sort of get compressed down into this measure of multifractality that seems to be implicated. So the effect sizes of the actual movements and the effect sizes of the multifractal interactions are very small, but they seem to be statistically powerful enough to sort of tap into what is unfolding. So
well, yeah, how smaller the effect size, how less reliable your model estimates are, especially if you're building big models, for example.
Right.
So I wonder, yeah.
No, that's a good question. Yeah.
So I'm sort of stuck on this this idea of measuring the motion this way. I think it's really very interesting. Because you could in theory, not just do rotation, right? You could do translation. And then you could change the gains, right? And at the same time, you could be measuring the actual motions of the head. And it sort of becomes interesting because you're now taking advantage of the virtual reality to essentially sort of insist that the exploration, the exploratory movements are more or less responsive to the actual movements.
Yeah. Had I the foresight, I would
No, I'm
have
not
gone
suggesting you
about
should have
doing
done it
this
that
very
way. I'm just saying
differently.
it's interesting. It might be a
You could do
complete,
that. You could do that.
it could be, you know, complete
Yeah.
mess, but it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one thing that I'm noticing that as we're watching, this is like a real participant, right?
Yeah.
Or-
It's a video playback of a
So-
real.
it-
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about the person who you brought into the lab, like sitting there on their chin rest, they're probably going to be taking a lot longer. They're going to be exposed to it a lot longer than they will doing this. And I'd imagine that if you were to do the same number of trials for a participant, that you would take a lot longer sitting in the lab than doing that, correct?
Yeah, so the pilot experiment where we had them actually sitting at a table had 27 trials.
Yeah.
These had upwards of 100.
Yeah.
27 trials led to 30-minute sessions.
Yeah.
These were also 30-minute sessions, but the actual experimental time was just like 10 minutes. In the real world, it was more like 15, 20 minutes. So yeah, there was this really disproportionate, setup in the actual paradigm. But
Yeah, and I think that might be something that would be interesting to explore, like force them, because I mean, if you see, like sometimes they go through multiple trials without even moving their head.
yeah.
So it would be interesting to make them do that, to make them sit there for like a couple of seconds, 5 seconds, something like that, before they can make that judgment.
Right.
In order to facilitate the movement, because otherwise, you like, as you said from your like looking at the mean, when people are looking at, when they don't move much at all, they're not too great at doing it, right? So like some of these are basically static pictures,
Yeah.
which would suggest that if you force them to maybe sit there longer, they might take more advantage of that time in their environment.
No, you're absolutely right. And given time and resources, I would set this up much more like the slope studies where we required them to move or at least consider the stimulus for much longer, which would generate more movement, and that would be a much finer grain. And then at that level, we'd be able to do analysis on a much finer sort of
Maybe even trial by trial.
trial by trial.
Yeah, exactly, which would be
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Great, amazing.
Part of the motivation for setting it up like this was to do this within subjects and with lots of trials and being able to sort of automate everything.
Yeah.
Because the real world lab experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're back,
No.
yeah.
Could I
Totally.
ask about the slope, something about the slope?
Yeah.
So I was curious, you don't know like whether if they're just looking at the slope and they have no anticipation, whether they, I don't know whether their movements are sort of imagining. I wonder like if you get similar results of sort of imagining whether you could, without seeing a slope, or do they do those sort of movements if they see a slope and they have no idea that they're going to be asked judgments? Is it?
Right. They go into it knowing and expecting the series of questions, but one thing that is sort of glaringly missing is how they're structuring their eye movements over the surface. So one of the things that I believe Alan is hoping to work on, we got rid of our big ramp.
Oh no.
Yeah, we packed it up and gave it away to whoever was in the hallway. But
Skateboarders, no doubt.
yeah, but
They're everywhere.
a big missing component is how they are exploring the ramp with their eyes, as opposed to just the little bit of wiggle in their posture, right? So they went into each trial with the expectations of all these questions and the sequence, and they got some practice over time.
But I did sort of wonder whether it's almost an imagination process, or if if you just simply visually look at one without like anticipating walking on it, whether it's.
So that's one of the really difficult questions, that getting at just a purely perceptual response without any kind of consequences. Obviously, if I'm asked to step onto a steep slope, I can look at it and say, yeah, I could totally stand on that, no problem. But then if I actually try to do it, I might fall off and hurt myself, right? So in those studies, we asked them to do the perceptual task, and then after the fact, we measured them actually standing on it. They weren't expecting to do that, though, so they didn't have any expectation of actually stepping onto it
Like this.
until we told them to do it. So
There we go.
So I mean, that's a very good point, yeah. So.
Here's a more theoretical question.
Yeah.
So the thing with multifractality measured from movement like here is that it could actually be reflecting two different things. One thing could be that you are moving multifractally in order to generate information that is multifractal. And that's what you're using. You want the multifractal information to assess a thing. Another explanation could be that you're moving multifractally regardless of the information, because that's actually a consequence of you tuning to the information internally. Or it could be both at the same time.
Right.
So what do you think? What are your intuitions on that?
That's a good question. I don't know that we really can answer that. I think that there is going to be sort of an individual difference component to that. People are going to be more complex in their movements compared to others, and I think that there's a lot that's implicated in that, anatomical features and the like. Whether or not that is driven by the task or whether or not that's driven by the individual differences, that's a really good question. And certainly should be looked at, but yeah, I don't know if I have enough to say that it could be one or the other. That I think that's just something that needs to be teased apart. But I guess it would be useful to sort of maybe sort of on the fly measure their complexity ahead of time before performing the task and seeing if that changes as a function of either learning or moment to moment, trial by trial. That would be a good question. That's something that I'm going to try
I
out.
think if you freeze the image,
Yeah.
and you still see multifractal structure in their movement, and they are as good at the task as they were before,
Yeah.
which I doubt. That's the hard part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really good point.
Well, I mean, in some ways, but this is frozen, insofar as you're not getting any perspectival changes. So that, I mean, tentatively from that, I would conclude it's the first of your two alternatives. The one where you're just trying to multifractally explore the information as opposed to create multifractal
Right.
information.
Yeah.
But
It's a brilliant way to end.
Oh, you finished, huh?
Mike's getting
That's
hungry,
my luck.
so.
I thought it was
Let's
a
have a
little
snack.
too early, but-
All right, thank you.
Thank you guys. This was really
Okay.
fun.
Well, that was great.
All right.
Great. Yes, we're doing the